A mother and daughter nervously enter the social services office in California. Irene, the mother, was virtually blind due to cataracts, but she was hardly the staff's cause for concern. Their attention was instead drawn to Irene's daughter, Jeannie, as they noticed something was deeply wrong. The year was 1970, and a few days before appearing in the office, Irene had had a heated argument with Clark, her husband. In a fit of anger, he threatened to kill Jeannie, their daughter. Fearing for their safety, Irene fled the house and sought refuge at her parents' home. After which she brought Jeannie with her to apply for disability benefits. Irene imagined her vision was dire enough to qualify as a disability. However, she mistakenly entered the social services office, where a worker was instantly drawn to Jeannie. The girl appeared to be a severely autistic 6-year-old. She drooled, spat constantly, wore a diaper, and didn't speak. In fact, she made no noise at all. The strangest thing being her walk, she stumbled along in a sitting position, incapable of extending her limbs properly or standing up straight. The staff member rushed to tell her superior, who in turn called the police. They immediately questioned Irene about her daughter's dire condition. Irene was hesitant and didn't give much information, fearing the potential consequence. However, slowly but surely, she opened up, and the more she explained, the worse it got. She revealed that Jeannie wasn't 6, nor was she autistic or even disabled in any way. She was instead 13 and the victim of arguably the worst case of abuse in human history. But what horrors had Jeannie endured to end up in such a state? Who was the monster responsible for inflicting the abuse? And what happened to her after she was rescued? To answer these questions, it's important we take a look at Jeannie's backstory, most notably her parents. Her father, Clark Wiley, was born in 1901. Clark's mother was a brothel owner who was mostly absent in his early life. His father died as a result of a natural disaster, so Clark spent most of his early childhood in limbo between various orphanages. During the Second World War, he became a flight mechanic, and in 1944 he married Irene Oglesby. The newlywed couple settled in California. Clark was an interesting character to say the least. He was known as being a very violent and controlling person. As soon as he married, Clark was quick to impose harsh control over Irene, isolating her from friends and family, as well as the outside world as a whole. She became increasingly secluded from everything except the couple's home. Because of this unstable childhood, Clark had a strong disliking toward children and certainly didn't wish to have any of his own. But in 1949, Irene fell pregnant. Likely in an attempt to cause a miscarriage, Clark beat Irene so badly she was hospitalized. However, whilst recovering, she gave birth to a healthy daughter. But disaster ensued. Clark found the babies crying insufferable, so much so that the newborn would be left in the freezing garage for days on end. She consequently died of pneumonia when she was just 10 weeks old. Irene would later give birth to another child. Unfortunately, things weren't getting any better. The baby boy would live for 2 days, quickly succumbing to hemolytic disease, occurring when the mother and the baby's blood aren't compatible with each other. A few years passed, and in 1952, Irene again gave birth to a son who they named John. He was also diagnosed with the same disease as her previous child, but fortunately, the doctors managed to save him. 5 years later, in 1957, Jeannie was born. Also suffering complications, but narrowly surviving. At 3 months old, Jeannie was diagnosed with congenital hip dislocation, requiring Jeannie to wear a restrictive hip brace for 8 months. In Clark's view, Jeannie was mentally retarded, and he began to isolate her from the outside world. In his opinion, it wasn't worth putting any effort into her development. 3 months later, she had her first appointment with a pediatrician as she was suffering from a fever and lung inflammation. The doctor was unable to fully understand Jeannie's case, likely as a result of her illness, leading him to believe that she had underlying issues stunting her development. This statement was enough evidence for Clark. To him, it confirmed his suspicion that his daughter was indeed severely mentally retarded. Not long after, the appointment tragedy struck. Clark's beloved mother was hit by a speeding truck. The impact caused severe injuries that proved fatal for the 77-year-old. Clark was obsessed with his mother, and her death left him paranoid, filling him with a complete mistrust of the outside world. This event seemed to be the catalyst of Clark's descent into madness. He became even more aggressive towards his family and ended up leaving his job. The family subsequently moved into his deceased mother's house. Clark didn't allow anyone in his mother's old room. He strangely preserved it, leaving it untouched. The entire family slept in the small living room. Clark was always present in this room, and if Irene or John made any minute mistake, he would punish them severely. John slept on a small wooden crate, with Irene and Clark sleeping in armchairs nearby. Clark would always have a revolver on his lap out of paranoia of intruders. Unlike the rest of the family, Jeannie was kept in a small bedroom situated at the back of the house. Her room had only 2 windows, but both of them had been taped up by Clark. She was only ever allowed to play with the 2 plastic raincoats that were hung in the room and look at TV pages, which were heavily censored by her father. The room was largely empty and only featured a chair, crib, and wardrobe. Since the doctor they met had said it would be difficult for Jeannie to live a long life, Clark began to predict that she would die before the age of 12. He promised Irene that if Jeannie lived past this age, they would seek professional help for her. He, of course, didn't honor this promise, but it seemed his main intention was to ensure Jeannie's death long before that time came. The neighbors were oblivious to the fact that the family even had a daughter, due to Jeannie never being let outside the house, let alone the confines of her own room. But Jeannie wasn't only stuck in her room, she was in fact bound there. During the day, she was tightly strapped to a makeshift potty. This was essentially just a chair with a hole cut out for Jeannie's excrement. Her arms and legs were tied to stop her playing with her own feces. The seat heavily restricted any movement and left a large calloused ring around her buttocks, an imprint of the hole Clark had made, and a testament to the sheer length of time spent in the seat. During the night, she was locked in a makeshift cage Clark had constructed out of her crib. He covered the top and sides with mesh to stop her getting out at any point. The cage additionally had a sleeping bag, able to be pulled so tight it prevented all movement, but she was put in the crib if lucky. Most nights, she would simply be left strapped naked to the chair. She was only ever given baby food, sloppy cereal, and sometimes hard-boiled eggs, which were hand-fed to her by her brother in silence. This was done as quickly as possible to limit the time spent with her. If she choked or vomited, it was rubbed into her face, and she'd be denied the rest of the meal. Silence was a large part of Jeannie's abuse, as Clark hated the noise she'd make and would subsequently beat her if she made even the slightest sound. He would even keep a wooden stick in the corner of the room for the very purpose, ready in case she dared to cry, laugh, or emit any noise at all. Clark would even crouch outside of the door, aggressively barking and growling, scratching and pounding at it, simply to terrify the little girl. She subsequently grew deathly afraid of dogs in later life, reportedly running into oncoming traffic just to avoid them. According to books on the case, there were much more instances of abuse which were held from public knowledge, given their sheer severity and twisted nature. Clark's beatings were for the most part the only human interactions she experienced, as Irene was deterred from entering the room. It was like this that Jeannie spent years on end, bound in place naked, staring at the same blank wall all day. She was bound to the chair all the way up until age 13. On the day of the argument, Clark had left the home shortly. Irene seized the opportunity, rushing to free Jeannie and running away to seek refuge at her parents', subsequently leading to officials discovering Jeannie. At first, people were baffled, simply incapable of imagining how a child could end up in such a state. Jeannie, never having eaten much solid food, was incapable of chewing and had great difficulty swallowing. She spat endlessly onto anything, no matter where she was. As a testament to the time spent in the potty chair, she was incapable of running and could only walk in an awkward fashion, swaying side to side as if she was still sitting in the chair. Jeannie's vision was also very poor, being that she had only ever seen 10 feet in front of her at all times. Even in extreme pain or anger, she made no verbal reaction. She didn't cry or laugh, suggesting she was still deathly afraid of Clark's punishments. So what punishment would Irene and Clark receive? And what would become of Jeannie? Detective Franklin Lee investigated the case. According to him, Clark had turned his back on the world after his mother's death. He described the Wiley house as extremely dark. Searching the house, he found no toys or even clothes, nothing which would indicate that any child had ever lived there. Clark and Irene were taken to the station for interrogation, but Clark refused to answer as if he didn't acknowledge the circumstances of his arrest. Before the trial could start against Clark, he shot himself in his home. He left 2 suicide notes, one addressed to John and the other to the police. In his note to the authorities, he stated that the world will never understand. On the other hand, when Irene went to trial, her lawyers argued that she wasn't responsible for Jeannie's neglect, as she was also a victim of Clark's violence and control. As a result, all charges against her were dropped, meaning nobody was truly held accountable for Jeannie's suffering, as well as the death of the couple's firstborn. So what became of Jeannie? The details of her case quickly gained widespread attention. It was such a unique event that soon enough, she had scientists falling over each other, dying to study her. Humans have always gone to grotesque lengths in the name of scientific research, such as the cruel experiments done in Nazi Germany or Japan's Unit 731. But harsher restrictions simply don't allow such harmful practices anymore. Irene and Clark had done what no other scientist would dare to, thereby garnering Jeannie an incredible amount of attention. Upon the evaluation of Jeannie's emotional and cognitive abilities, James Kent said she was the most deeply damaged child he had ever seen. Jeannie's silence and inability to use language made it extremely difficult to assess her mental abilities. But in the tests that were done at that time, she was deemed as having the cognitive abilities of a 1-year-old. Susan Curtis, a linguist who studied Jeannie, recalled her as a deeply curious child with an intense fascination for the world. Although Jeannie initially made remarkable progress in language acquisition, she eventually plateaued, unable to overcome certain linguistic barriers, which would usually be acquired in early life. In 1971, David Rigler, a professor and chief psychologist, temporarily took Jeannie into his home, an arrangement that eventually lasted 4 years. Although Jeannie struggled with certain behaviors such as spitting, taking other children's belongings, and defecating inappropriately, she began to show glimpses of progress. Classical piano seemed to captivate her, perhaps because of the neighbor's piano lessons during her isolation had been her only consistent exposure to sound. At David's house, Jeannie attended a specialized school where she interacted with other children. She developed a sense of humor, learned basic skills like ironing and sewing, and expressed herself through drawings, often using them to communicate when words failed her. Meanwhile, Jeannie's mother, Irene, regained her eyesight after cataract surgery and moved back to her home. Although she visited Jeannie occasionally, she felt unwelcome at the Riglers' home and resented the researchers, believing they looked down on her. Irene also never accepted responsibility for Jeannie's abuse, a stance that many scientists questioned. She maintained a friendship with Jean Butler, who claimed that Jeannie's condition had actually worsened under David's care. After 4 years, in 1975, the research grant supporting Jeannie's care was denied. The initial progress she made had slowed significantly, and few academic papers had resulted from the study. With no funding to continue, Jeannie was once again uprooted. She was allowed to return home to live with her mother, bringing her back to the very place her trauma began. Unsurprisingly, this arrangement failed. Jeannie's mother struggled to manage her care, and social services stepped in once more, placing Jeannie with a new foster family. Unfortunately, this move was disastrous as the foster parents maintained a strict, militant-style household that clashed with Jeannie's needs. Eventually, Jeannie's condition deteriorated to the point where she became malnourished. Curtis intervened, convincing authorities to readmit her to the children's hospital. The legal battles continued to plague Jeannie's story. Irene alleged that the researchers had subjected Jeannie to relentless testing, often up to 70 hours a week. The tensions ended as a result of a legal settlement in March 1979. Irene agreed to grant researchers limited access to Jeannie under specific conditions, and Jeannie was promised all future income from research royalties. Irene Wiley eventually secluded Jeannie in a home for mentally disabled adults, preventing any further access by scientists. David in particular was devastated by this and continues to miss Jeannie. Jeannie visited her mother once a month, but in 1987, Irene sold her house and disappeared, leaving no forwarding address. It's believed that she died in 2003 while living in California. According to some sources, Jeannie is still alive in a state-run adult care facility in Los Angeles. It's fair to say there never really was a happy ending to this story. Jeannie, once no longer deemed interesting, was left to strict institutions which enforced harsh verbal and physical abuse. This put an end to her progress and made her regress completely. According to Russ Reimer, who visited her on her 29th birthday, she appeared miserable